This is our 2024 edition, and we're really delighted to have you all here with us today. So our session is Knowing and Understanding Environmental Change, and we have a brilliant set of speakers with us today. My name is Alexis McGivern, and I direct the program on the Oxford side. Frederick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm so excited for this session. And hello, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, wherever you are. Greetings from you. My name is Frederick Binamung Simon, and I'm coming from Tanzania. I am African Global Youth representative from GYC. So I'm so excited from you all joining here, and congratulations for everyone who made it. Thank you so much, Alexis. Maybe we continue and moving forward.
Yes, amazing. So you guys will have all seen this already in your program booklet, but we have some key learning outcomes today. So the first is articulating and different ways of knowing and understanding climate change, summarizing 5 key takeaways from the recent IPCC AR6 to bring to any public-facing messaging on climate. That's John Lang, who's going to be covering that for us today. We're also going to have Joy explaining effective climate storytelling techniques. And then we'll finish this session with Tim walking us through the science behind carbon dioxide removal and different techniques and risks. So we have a packed agenda today, so we'll be moving pretty quickly through our speakers. We'll begin with a speech from Roa Alabed, who's our youth speaker for today, and Frederick will be introducing her in just a minute. Then we have John Lang, the lead of the Net Zero Tracker, Joy Lee, head of editorial at Earthrise Studio, and Tim Kruger, senior associate at Oxford Net Zero, which is the research group that is running this training. Throughout, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or use the Q&A box. And just to start us off, we'd love to hear where everyone is tuning in from today. So if you want to put that in the Zoom chat, as well as on the chat on YouTube for those of you who are watching on the live stream. And with that, pass over to Frederick.
Oh, thank you so much. Before we dive in into today's session, I would like to introduce our youth speaker and called Loza Ibedin. Loza worked at Yungo as a contact point in 2023, and now she is a part of the global coordination team working directly with the UNFCCC. She has also taken part into international negotiation and organized side events at the Conferences of Parties COP29. Africa Climate Week to spread awareness of the connection between climate change and human mobility. She is also climate ambassador at the Connect for Climate and World Bank Group and YARI, Young Africa Leaders Initiative, ALMON. As a CEO of African Active, she co-hosted the 2024 regional conferences of youth in Morocco, Arakoy. Through this space, she has been able to discuss strategies to work with the stakeholders and address climate endurance migration in Africa. So you have 10 minutes. Go ahead. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. This is Ra. I'm so excited to be here, and hopefully that you are going to enjoy this 10 minutes with me. So basically, I will talk about the youth in climate change. The first question will be, why youth? Why now everyone is talking about youth in climate change, youth in everything? Simply, we can say that the youth are the next generation of climate leader. This is a map highlighting the number of youth in the percentage of youth. And can you see, for example, in Africa, 15% of the population in Africa is youth. In Asia, is 29. So can you see the huge number of the youth who will be tomorrow leader? Next, please. Okay, so youth have been since through the history, can we find so many movement for youth? There is so historical movement. I will take you through an example, which is Yango. Next, please. The official children and youth constituency, which I'm now part of it. Yango history starts since 1992, since the Rio Earth Summit. Then youth keep fighting since that till 25 at the Montreal Conference of Party, then till 2019 to 2009 was the first time that youth has been announced as observer in the global conferences till 2011. Finally, the constituency is confirmed as official children and youth constituency at the UNFCCC. And since that till today, Yango is still serving. So youth since very old age, they have been historically moving and working for the earth, for the climate, for a better life. Next, please. Okay, so if you ask me, I'm a youth, I'm interested, I want to make a change, how I can do it? I will share with you like 6 examples where we can be involved in the climate space. Next, please. The first thing, the power of social media. We all now have a social media, we all have an Instagram, we all have TikTok, but if we want to use it in a smart way, we can. And now social media become one of the biggest, I'm not saying weapon, but the biggest, they make a big impact in our life. Now you can just go and open a live in TikTok and make a change. And there are so many influencers who are making great impact through social media. And also today there is a huge full session about the use of social media and storytelling. So think about how you can use your social media wisely. You can use your Instagram for climate movement. You can use your TikTok also for climate movement. Next, please. Also through education and awareness. Now, what is happening now, this is a very unique opportunity. Also, there is so way of education. Either you can go through library, you can search in Google. There is so many organizations that working on education and raising awareness. And now there is so many books and paper that are talking about climate change. So whatever you search, you can find anything. So go and educate yourself and know what's happening. Okay, next, please. Also, advocacy and policy influence. Yeah, we are youth, we are still young, but we can influence the policy. Now, wherever you go, to COP, to SP, all the global negotiation, there is a space for youth. There is a space of youth. This photo for me last year in COP29, and I was speaking at the people plenary. It was a stage, the room was full of thousands of people. So never think that you are youth, you are small. No, we are youth, we are big, we can influence and we can speak in the global stage. Next, please. Also, there is so many grassroots movement. This is a photo from a project that we are working on. It's called Climate Touch Network in Uganda. So through this small initiative, we are working on grassroots. We are doing some trees planting activity. We are working on a plastic soup campaign. We are working on giving some sustainable product to a villager. So also you can you can also go through field and work at level of your community, your village, your small city, and still make a change. Okay, next, please. Also now there is innovation and so many people who are working in innovation that are making so great impact. They are making some great initiatives for climate. They are making so many new, and every day there is so new discovery. And even you can one day become a scientist and you can make an impact and you can do something great. Next, please. Okay, when you are talking about climate change, there is so many interdisciplinary that's coming through a term of climate change. So I can give you just 1 minute to observe this photo. You can see, I will just give you 1 minute to see what is written here. Okay, so when you are talking about an issue, you are going to respect, there is so many issues. For example, the first girl is talking about gender, talking about climate, in power, women in power, climate change, history, geography, politics, economic. So climate change is multidisciplinary, and when you talk about climate change, you can just focus on one thing. There is so many things that come in, and there's so many. Even now, if you come through the COP agenda, you can find the agenda are so diverse. Starting from the health, there's education, there is art, there is biodiversity, there is nature. So this is something to put in your mind. Next, please. Also, the intersection in climate action. Now, when we are talking about the youth movement, there is so many groups. You can start youth. Now children are involved. The LGBTQ group, the woman and gender. So climate space is the biggest space, and everyone is welcome to work on it. Okay. Next, please. The last thing is building alliance across generation. Now we are talking about youth, and we are saying, yes, youth are tomorrow leader, youth are the power for tomorrow. But we also are not going to say, let's work with youth and forget about the those who are elderly or adults. No, in climate, building alliance across generation are so important. We still need those who are 50 or 60. They are our history. They know better than us. Yes, we have the power, but they know well about the environment. They are scientists. So we need to work with them. So we still need them. And we can't work alone at the youth. Last thing I can say it, because I know here all of you are youth, you are never too small to make a difference. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So this earth, this planet that we are now living it, we have to give it to our children in a better way, not saying, okay, this is what our grandfather gave us. No, it's our responsibility to take care of our planet, and it's our responsibility to our children to give them the earth in a better way. So yeah, this is from my side. I hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you all.
Wow, such a wonderful. Thank you so much for this insightful keynote presentation. And thank you so much, Laura. It's as an excellence to hear these practical tips on how to get involved as youth. Actually, we always say that there's nothing for youth without us. And I would like now to introduce Langa, Net Zero Tracker lead at the Energy Climate Intelligence Unity, who will be speaking about the latest IPCC AR6 report. John Lance, the Net Zero Tracker, an international consortium project spearheaded by ECIU and specializes in communicating climate science and policy to the public. A new Netherlands qualified lawyer, John also runs the E-Environment, a climate communication blog, Consultants Climate, a sustainability consultants, and QVC in climate. And now, Nani Patterson, a group of the international new and involved in climate and related field. He earned a Master's of Law in Policy and Health Science from UCL and undergraduate degree in History and Law from the University of Ontario. Sorry if I misspelling some of the word, but I hope this will be very much crucial. So welcome, Mr. John, and the floor is yours.
No, thank you, Frederick. That's a very handsome introduction. I don't know if I've ever had an introduction like it. So thank you, and also thank you, to Roa and Alexis for having me. So as Frederick mentioned, I lead the Net Zero Tracker. But in my spare time, I like to explain climate change science and climate change policy to the public, and I do that through visuals. I find doing infographics is an incredibly impactful way to get the message across. So today, I am going to give you a whirlwind tour of my infographic on the IPCC 6 Assessment Reports Synthesis Report. So we'll get into what that even means in 2 seconds. But I think first and foremost, let's start with what the IPCC is. So as you can see here, the IPCC, it is a UN body of government representatives that commissions expert reports on the state of the climate. The IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And every 7 years or so, it provides massive systemic reviews of the world's current climate knowledge. As I've mentioned, it's intergovernmental. So every IPCC report needs to be endorsed by all 195 member nations before publication. That means, or it's supposed to mean, that governments shouldn't ignore the findings that they themselves have endorsed. IPCC reports are usually compiled by hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists from all over the world, and they contribute thousands of hours to each IPCC report. So for this 6 report assessment, they happen to be about 7 years. 782 experts took part from 91 nations. And so what is the 6 assessment report? So the first report, compiled by Working Group 1, tackled the science of climate change. So they assessed the scientific basis of the climate system and how we're changing it. The second report looked at the impacts and the vulnerability to human and natural systems and our options for adapting to climate change. The third report was about how we mitigate and reduce emissions and also remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's looking at the human options to mitigate emissions, but also adapt to climate change. And then as you can see down here in that blue circle, they also compiled a synthesis report, and that is the report that we're going to go through today. So just a little bit more about the assessment report cycle that the IPCC does. So it also includes other special reports. So in 2018, that kicked off the cycle, and they launched a report called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Then they also did a report on climate change in land and the ocean and cryosphere. And so that represented, as you can see down here, can you see my cursor, by the way? Great. So this shows the full 6 assessment report cycle, and that shows the 7 reports, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And here you can also see a timeline of the IPCC. So you can see here that it was founded in 1988, and then it's continued along, and this was its 6th assessment report. And I think it's really important to say that the IPCC is actually a catalyst for climate action. So you can see where the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. Across 2013 and 2014, the IPCC produced its 5th assessment report, and that directly informed the Paris Agreement that was then signed by 195 nations. Another good example of the IPCC being a catalyst for climate action was in 2018, it launched its Global Warming of 1.5 degrees special report. And as some of you will remember, that coincided with the rise of Greta Thunberg, the rise of net zero targets proliferating all over the world. So the IPCC plays an integral role in catalyzing climate action. I'm going to just scroll back up a little bit. And so this section here, the big picture, this is also a kind of contents of the infographic that I'm going through, but I'm just going to talk you through it very quickly. So we stand on the cusp of severe climate impacts, but also on the cusp of an exponential energy transition away from fossil fuels. So that's a really important point. So there are huge risks, but there's also a massive opportunity here. It's real, it's us, it's bad. I'm going to take us through those sections. I'm also going to take us through the fix, and that's net zero. I won't repeat those now because we're going to go into them in depth. Also, we're going to tackle that adaptation is essential and that solutions are available now. So we're going to end with the good news because there is lots of good news here. To the left there, you can see this human face. This just shows how relevant climate change is to human populations. So as you can see there, almost 3.5 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And 6 billion people could be exposed to periods of life-threatening climatic conditions due to extreme heat and humidity by 2100. Right, I'm going to skip down and we're going to start and get into this. So I like to use Katharine Hayhoe. Some of you may have heard of Katharine Hayhoe. If you haven't, I'd look her up. She's probably the best climate communicator in the world. So she goes through a formula. She says climate change is real, it's us, it's bad, but we can fix it. So at a really high level, I've used that to structure this infographic. So the world is heating up because carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere. The growing thickness of this extraplanetary blanket has caused widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, biosphere, cryosphere, and ocean. As you can see here, humans emit about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. Just to bring that to life a little bit, that's the equivalent in weight to about 860,000 Titanics. And since 1750, we've emitted over 2,500 billion tons of CO2, and that's equal to about the weight of 53 million Titanics. Over here on the right, you can see heating to date. That actually almost needs updating because we're at about 1.3 degrees since 1850, but you can see there we're fast approaching the Paris Agreement goals. So coming down slightly. As you can see there, this is a time series of temperatures. We're supposed to be gently cooling, but at about 1850, the Industrial Revolution began, and we started increasing our emissions into the atmosphere. And as you can see, that's culminated in the last decade being hotter than any other period for at least 125,000 years. It's us. And it's unequivocal that human activities have warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Science indicates that human activities are responsible for 100% of modern-day global heating. So as you can see here, there are multiple lines of evidence, and I'm not going to go into them all. This is just a very light overview of those multiple lines of evidence. But as you can see there, science shows us that solar and volcanic drivers and natural variability are not the drivers of current climate change. It is greenhouse gases emitted by human beings. You can see on the left, there are also some factors that actually have a cooling effect. Again, I won't dive into the details, but that's mainly to do with air pollution that we put up into the atmosphere. The other lines of evidence I'm profiling here is atmospheric warming. So as the lower atmosphere heats up due to an enhanced greenhouse effect, the upper part is cooling as a consequence. And the bottom part, the troposphere, is warming up. And then I also dive into a little bit of chemistry for any chemistry geeks out there. But I'm going to skip over that because we're fast running out of time. So climate change is also bad. Temperatures will continue to increase until mid-century under all scenarios. Without deep reductions in emissions, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees will be exceeded this century. Weather extremes are becoming more widespread and pronounced with every increment of heating. Every single ton of CO2 we put up into the atmosphere is having a warming effect. And here I just pass over a few examples. Again, if you want more in-depth information, I can share my other infographics on the specific Working Group 1 to Working Group 3 reports. I will put those links in the chat at the end of this. You can see here, and I think this is quite a misunderstood point, but temperature increase over land is 40% larger than global mean heating. And where do people live? They live on land. So the land's actually heated up by about 1.7 degrees Celsius compared to the ocean, which has increased by just under 1 degree. And there you can see the importance of the ocean. The ocean has absorbed about 25% of human CO2 emissions to date. and it's also absorbed about 90% of the excess heat caused by us. Unfortunately, many changes are baked in for thousands of years. Changes to global sea level, the ocean, and ice sheets are irreversible on timescales relevant to humans. Again, you can see some examples of that. So sea level rise, which we'll dive into just beneath, changing chemistry of the ocean, and glacier retreat. For example, on ice sheets, at sustained heating of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, ice sheets will be lost irreversibly over multiple millennia. The West Antarctic ice sheet will see a complete loss, and the Greenland ice sheet will see a near complete loss. Sea level rise from global heating will continue for centuries, maybe millennia. It's going to put 1 billion people at risk, and it's not just risks around flooding. By 2050, extreme sea level events that occurred once per century will be 20 to 30 times more frequent. And it's a low likelihood, but it's also a high impact scenario, but we could actually see a much higher sea level rise if ice sheet processes become unstable. The good news here is that the rate of sea level rise can be slowed down. Even though it's irreversible, it can be slowed down by steep emission reductions and give us more time for adaptation. Some more good news. We know how to fix climate change because science has been beavering away. The tools to fix the climate problem and stabilise temperatures at safer levels are available now. We know the future will be different. Just how different depends on choices now and in the near term, specifically the speed at which human-sized societies halve emissions and achieve net zero. Now, I can't go through all this timeline here, but feel free to have a look at it when I share the link in the chat. But as you can see here, if we scroll down, we get very divergent pathways over one human lifetime, depending on what we decide to do. If we reduce emissions drastically, we halve emissions by the early 2030s and get to net zero about mid-century, we can stabilise temperatures. If we don't, as you can see here, heating will continue past 2100. I often like to use the bathtub analogy to show what we actually need to do. So just very quickly, again, I'll share this. We are currently filling up the bathtub very quickly. So we're filling up the atmosphere with human CO2 emissions. We need to turn that tap off aggressively. Also, you'll see down here to the left, we've got a CO2 removals drain. Now that drain is theoretical. We are not actually removing CO2 at scale. And I'm sure Tim Kruger, who will be speaking soon, will tackle this in more detail. But you can see there, we are disturbing the carbon cycle. And what is the best form of CO2 removal? I'm not sure. Well, we can pose the question to Tim later, but for me, it's turning down the human CO2 emissions tap through emission reductions. And we should never lose that message. Here I show the formula. We need to halve emissions by 2030. We need to get to net zero by the early 2050s. And we need strong, sustained reductions in other greenhouse gases, especially methane and nitrous oxide. And this is directly from the IPCC. They also say that the path we take is very, very important to determine the total amount of CO2 that accumulates in the atmosphere, and so how much damage we cause. So as you can see there, the diagrams, the less cumulative emissions, the less the global heating. The world must rapidly shift away from the burning of fossil fuels, which accounts for nearly 90% of our CO2 emissions. As you can see down here, we've got our CO2 budgets versus fossil fuels. For our 1.5 degree budget, we only have 210 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 left, and we emit about 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. So that only gives us about 5 years unless we drastically cut emissions. So we need to use far less fossil fuel. As you can see there, here are some indicative rates of what we need to be doing by 2030 and by 2050 to give ourselves a chance of containing heating at 1.5 degrees. Climate finance must also increase for net zero. Over here on the right, you can see that finance is 1/6 of where it needs to be. So we really need to increase those financial flows. And developing nations especially need that money. They need between 4 to 8-fold more annual investment until 2030. The good news is that deep decarbonisation across all sectors of the economy will not cost the earth. So you can see in terms of GDP rates, the IPCC scientists and economists have worked this one out. It's actually the cost of moving to, and it shouldn't even be framed as the cost, it should be framed as the investment, but the investment to move to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees warming is very, very minimal. I won't spend long on CO2 removal because Tim will, I'm sure, talk about how it is necessary for net zero, and that's what the IPCC told us very clearly. But the big point here with CO2 removal is that it's untested at scale, and there's no guarantee it will succeed. Again, I'll leave the definition of what CO2 removal, and I'm just going to skip down this section because Tim will be tackling this. One thing I will just spend a little bit of time looking at. Now, if we do overshoot these temperature goals, so 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we can actually return to those temperature limits. Again, I think this is a very important message because we are likely to overshoot 1.5 degrees, but we can bring that back down. Now, it will be very expensive, but we can bring those temperatures down if we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Transformational adaptation is essential. Climate change has impacted human and natural systems across the world, with those who have generally done the least to cause climate change being the most vulnerable. For example, the 10% of households with the highest per capita CO2 emissions contribute only 34 to 45% of global emissions. The bottom 50% contribute 13 to 15%. What does effective adaptation look like? So it's things like improving equity and justice. It's also ecosystem-based adaptation and new technologies and infrastructure. Again, I can't have time to dive into the details on adaptation here, but I do have an infographic that I will share. And what do we need? We need climate resilient development. So we need to bridge both mitigation and adaptation strategies to deal with the climate risks. But relying on adaptation is not enough. The more we invest in climate mitigation now, the better we can adapt and the less it will cost. The better we can adapt, the less the loss and damage. Mainstreaming effective and equitable climate action now will reduce losses and damages in the future. So if you're wondering what loss and damage is, it can be defined as costly damage from climate-related disasters such as cyclones or from gradual changes like desertification and rising sea levels. Right, we really are onto the good news now. So solutions are available and they're cheap. So as you can see here, mitigation options are available at a cost of less than $100 a tonne of CO2 equivalent, and that could reduce emissions to about half by 2030. Fully deployed, this fruit bowl of options would keep 1.5 degrees alive. And just to be clear, the IPCC doesn't talk about fruit bowls, but I thought I'd use the fruit bowl analogy because I think it's helpful. So you can see here, I've divided the bowls up into low-hanging fruit and higher-hanging fruit. And so examples of low-hanging fruit are things like wind and solar, EVs or electric vehicles, reduced deforestation, public transport and cycling, and reducing methane emissions from fossil fuels. And examples of higher-hanging fruit are things like carbon capture and storage, aviation fuels, advanced nuclear, and reducing agriculture emissions. But to actually do those things, to do both the low-hanging fruit and the high-hanging fruit, we need innovation, we need good climate governance, we need to build institutional capacity in our nations, and we need really, really strong increased financial flows. There is also more good news. The CO2 emissions curve is bending. So the renewables revolution and stronger climate policies have already moved us away from the darkest climate futures. Climate policy has become widespread, clean energy has become cheap, and decoupling has become a reality in advanced economies. As you can see there, solar and wind capacity costs have declined by 85%, and same for batteries in just the last decade. And also the costs are plummeting when it comes to wind and also EVs. And adoption rates of EVs are skyrocketing, as you can see here down in the bottom right corner. The mix of policy instruments that reduce costs and stimulated adoption includes public research and development, funding for demonstration and pilot projects, and demand pull instruments such as deployment subsidies to attain scale. And finally, the bottom line. There are two variables that will determine how severely climate change will impact human civilization and the natural world. Both are uncertain. One, how the climate system responds to a given volume of CO2 emissions, and two, what volume of CO2 emissions we emit into Earth's atmosphere. We have power over the second variable. That means we have the power to choose our future. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, John. It's always such a pleasure to see your really clear science communication. It makes such a difference. So thank you so much. And for those of you who may not know, John and I work closely together on various projects. And it's always really great to have someone on the team who can take all of the jargon and actually make it make sense. So thanks so much and really appreciate your time. Now, next up, we have Joy Lee. Joy Lee is the head of editorial at Earthrise, and she'll be speaking to us today about effective climate storytelling and about the mission of Earthrise. So Joy is an Emmy-nominated journalist, producer, and correspondent who focuses on the intersections between environment, climate, and social equality. She is the head of editorial at Earthrise Studio, where she expands the climate narrative and champions diverse perspectives and tools in storytelling. She previously worked with outlets Al Jazeera English, Channel News Asia, and HuffPost across multimedia formats such as virtual reality, 360 video, film, photography, and audio, receiving over 25 awards for her work. And she is also a lovely friend. So I'm really delighted to have her here today. So Joy, over to you.
Hi, it's so great to see you all. Let me just quickly share my screen. Can you guys see this?
Yes, we can. Thanks so much.
Amazing. Let me just get my screen set up on my side. I just want to say thank you so much for having me here. It's so wonderful to be a part of this. And it was also really incredible to see the presentations that came before me. As John and Sharat mentioned as well, you know, the importance of social media and visual storytelling and language in order to kind of help break down the complexities of the climate crisis and the science behind it. So that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. I'm speaking from and behalf of Earthrise Studio, which I want to break down and give you a brief introduction before we start into the things and challenges that we faced when it comes to climate change storytelling and the things that we've learned along the way, and hopefully some useful tips in case any of you guys are also interested in visual storytelling. So Earthrise is an impact-driven media platform that focuses very deeply on spotlighting the front lines of the climate crisis and trying to introduce and break down these complex topics for a young global audience. Before we run into what tips we've learned, I just want to give you a little bit more introduction. So why the word Earthrise? I don't know if you guys ever seen this image before. This was taken in 1968 on a NASA Apollo 8 mission to the moon by astronaut William Anders. The photo was dubbed Earthrise, and it's one of the first times that we got to see the image of Earth from space. and really represents a moment where our shifting perspective helped us understand this pale little dot that we live in and how interconnected we are to each other, and how important it is to take care of the home that we have. We started 4 years ago. I'm sure that if we all kind of reflect on what 2020 was like, we could all remember a few things. For example, the global pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, growing cost of living around the world, and a worsening climate crisis. So Earthrise really began as a response to the growing social inequalities that we were seeing all over the world, and realizing that the climate crisis is deeply intertwined with all of these other factors. And in a time where people were increasingly moving online, we realized how important it is to help contribute to the conversation that was unfolding on social media. Our tagline is "We tell stories for a new world," really about how do we explain what's happening, but also try to help move our audience and the people who are reading our content to really be rethinking the kind of solutions that we need in order to address the challenges that we see today. Just to kind of give a context on why storytelling is important, of course, when we're facing things like climate change, we need, policy and leaders and governments and science to really step up, but we also need narratives and to change in order to get people to really care about the issue. I always use a statistic. The cognitive psychologist once said, people remember stories 22 times better than facts alone. They really have the power to engage our emotions and to get us to care. Our theory of change is that if you shape the stories will help inform the culture, which will shape our values, which will help select our leaders who write our policy that hold up our systems. So what we do here in making a difference within the stories can have ripple effects across this chain. So this is why we focus on stories. We use social content because we're really trying to speak to young global audience. We've reached over 50 million people and platformed over 100 storytellers and created over 1,500 original assets and stories. We reach an online audience of around 2.5 across our channels and our founders' channels, and are primarily speaking to the age of 18 through 35 across 45 different countries. And the aim here is to not just focus on people who are deeply embedded in the climate space, but also to engage young people who might be adjacent to the conversation, but feel like they don't have the tools to really speak and be a part of the conversation. We've interviewed and collaborated and worked with people all the way from Barack Obama to David Attenborough to Greta Thunberg to also grassroots and local communities all over the world. We think it's very important also to showcase the breadth of people working across different sectors within the climate space, but also from the policy level down to the grassroots activism level. Now, that's my introduction of Earthrise. I want to then step back a bit and look at why do we need to talk about the challenges within climate storytelling and what are the things that we faced so far. I come back to this quote from The Guardian time and time again. Climate change is the biggest story journalism has never successfully told. Now, this was a few years ago, but I think we're still seeing a lot of the same challenges today. The stories we tell, who tell them, and how we tell them aren't working. If you Google climate change on your phone and look at the images, these are the images that pop up, just to give you a taste of some of the challenges that we face when it comes to storytelling. And these are some of the top challenges. Often people feel that the climate crisis is too abstract, that it's too far away. When you see images like this, you see polar bears, you see graphics, almost kind of like an AI CG put together visuals, but nowhere here do you see the impacts that it's had on humans, on communities, how this might relate to the things that you and I and everyone around the world goes through. So how do we move away from this? Another challenge that we face is, I mean, according to some studies, I mean, this is very difficult to quantify, but one study showed that up to 98% of environmental stories are told with a negative frame. If you look again, Google climate change, and you look at the headlines that come up, beyond just the visuals, the headlines are very, very doom and gloom and really paint a very, very bleak picture. So it's no wonder that the impact of these stories has left people feeling very, very tired and very, very exhausted. A study that was done by The Lancet in 2021 surveyed 10,000 young people around the world in 10 different countries when it came to their attitudes of climate change. Over half of young people said that humanity is doomed. About 3/4 of them said that the future is frightening. And of course, when you look at the media and the types of stories that we see and understand that young people are constantly consuming stories online, that's not necessarily surprising. But what happens when people feel despair and anxiety is that they often feel that they're alone and they feel powerless. But what's really interesting is that actually global concern for climate change is at an all-time high. And so people aren't actually alone. And there's something really interesting here with a perception gap that we're seeing. Most people systematically underestimate popular support for climate action around the world. One study that was done showed that in the US in particular, 80 to 90% of Americans underestimated support for climate policies. They thought that just about a third of Americans were supporters, where actually the number was anywhere from 2/3 to about 80%. Another study showed that it was similar in China, but across the board, it seems that we are constantly underestimating how much other people care. And actually, a study that was done this past summer called the People's Climate Vote, it is the world's largest standalone public survey when it comes to climate change, found that 80% of people around the world want stronger climate action by government. So what we're seeing is that there's a growing coverage of climate stories, but most of it is still quite negative. And it's not doing the job of fulfilling that perception gap and letting people know that things are being done and people around the world are starting to care. So the challenges that we face is that we don't have enough of the right climate stories. The stories that we see are mired in negative framing. And 3, when we're looking at a global climate crisis that requires a global coalition of action and solutions and mobilization, the stories and reporting that we're seeing of climate are doing nothing to contribute to a sense of empowerment or sense of what we can be doing to move forward. So when we look at the things that where we want to move forward with climate storytelling, we need a diversity of climate stories, solutions-driven framing, and stories that reflect and showcase community and empowerment and different ways that we can move forward in order to kind of activate the everyday person around the world. So I'm going to go through a few of the different examples that we've done at Earthrise and the stories that we've told with a few different things that we've learned just to kind of help illustrate what I mean by these things. So diversity of climate stories. We need wide-ranging stories that target first the heart and then the mind. People are more willing to engage with an issue if they feel that it speaks to something that resonates with them. So stories that speak to people's lives, that are relatable, that are accessible. So what we often do is we mix in some very kind of broad picture explainer pieces, but also then break down much more complex topics and issues. But the most important thing is to make things feel accessible and also sometimes enjoyable for people to be learning about. Tell stories from different angles. Again, people care about things that matter to them. One study showed that health, personal health, is the second most important thing to a person's life, second only to their relationship with their family. So how do we talk about health issues when it comes to climate change? So we did a series called Antidote with BBC, where we looked at the public health, where public health intersects with climate. How do we capture the interest of young people who might not necessarily be thinking about climate change, but, for example, care about music? We did something with Ellie Goulding, who's a big pop star around the world, where she brought in music and nature together in a collaboration on one of her tracks. How do we talk about politics? So 4 billion people were set to vote in elections this year. How do we take that and then, connect it to climate issues? How do we connect it to the fashion industry? How do we talk about food? How do we talk about livelihoods and economics? So really finding the different angles to meet people where they're at in ways that they understand impact their lives. We also need a diversity, not just of climate stories, but also of storytellers. So it's probably no surprise and no shock that a lot of the climate journalism is coming out of global north countries, and as well as beyond just the journalists, myself included, but also the experts and scientists who are helping shape our knowledge around climate change. So Reuters releases a hot list of 1,000 of the world's top climate scientists. I believe only 5%, actually it was 0.5% of this were African-based scientists. So, that to me says quite a lot, where so many of the climate impacts that we're seeing is, of course, across the Africa region, as well as in places in Asia. I mean, over 3/4 of the global population live in Asia and Europe, yet over 3/4 of the scientists on the list were located in Europe and North America. So how do we also think about diversifying the people who have the expertise and the knowledge behind the stories that then get reported to the public? And so things that we also do is making sure that we're telling stories from and about different communities around the world. During Ramadan this year, we did a few different pieces around climate change and different Muslim communities, both in the UK, but also abroad. We looked at Colombia and their endorsement of a thing called the Fossil Fuel Treaty. We also interviewed community activists in Scotland about energy poverty. And also, when we think about solutions framing, how do we tell stories that reveal and reflect the different and incredible things that are being achieved around the world? We've done a few on legal achievements. Ecuador won a historic vote and referendum to end and halt oil drilling in the Amazon, in one of the most biodiverse spots in the world. We've covered things like Colombian indigenous knowledge gaining UNESCO cultural heritage status, and of course, rights of nature and legal personhood. We've also done a series called Spotlight. It was a 12-part series with Bloomberg, where every episode looks at a different solution. We looked at trees and what that means to plant trees. We looked at recycling sewage water to address the water crisis in different countries around the world. We again looked at legal personhood and looked at things like plastics and the electric revolution. But one of the things that we tried to tread very carefully, we know that technological innovation is skyrocketing, and there are a lot of things to be extremely, extremely excited and hopeful for, but to also focus on stories that go beyond just the technocratic solutions, and also think about the systemic issues at the heart of how communities are experiencing the climate crisis. And lastly, stories that also just showcase the way that different communities are mobilizing around the world, so that people can also see reflected in those stories, I guess, hope and inspiration for themselves, and to also understand that there is individual action that can be done as well as collective action. So some of the stories that we've covered, I interviewed this incredible woman from Indonesia who runs this Youth Act group where they fight against wildfires and protect their community members with health shelters. I also interviewed this incredible activist in Hawaii who works with her community to protect their land from development. Also this incredible community in Peru who is working in collaboration with scientists to help save the alpacas that are so dear to their livelihoods, but are being confronted and impacted by the impacts of climate change. We're also working on a feature film called The Mother of All Fights. This woman is Sonia Guajajara. She is an Indigenous activist who ran for Congress 2 years ago and miraculously won, while also bringing an entire collective of other Indigenous female activists with her into the seats and corridors of power in Brazilian politics. She took on Bolsonaro government, and she became the first ever. Not only did she win Congress, she also then was appointed by President Lula as a first ever Minister of Indigenous Peoples. And so through this, of course, when you think about telling community stories, people around the world, it's always, of course, really important to build long-term relationships and trust. And in doing so and highlighting all these different communities, hopefully this also brings to our audience and to the people reading our stories that there's so many different paths for action. There's so many different ways that people are responding to and adapting to and mitigating climate change, both from an individual to a collective to a systemic level. And I think that is it from my end. Thank you.
This, Joy, thank you so much. It's always so great to hear about the amazing work that you guys are doing at Earthrise. I love what you guys do, and it's so inspiring to see how thoughtful you guys are about climate storytelling. So thank you so much for being with us. And just to mention that the slides and everything, I'll come to this a little bit later, but they're in our shared Google Drive, so you can go through everyone's beautiful. We had beautiful slides today in that shared drive. So thank you so much, Joy. So now moving on to our final speaker, Tim Kruger. Tim, who is a colleague of mine at Oxford Net Zero, and he'll be speaking about carbon removals and how we think about carbon removals in the context of the 1.5 degree temperature limit that you heard about in John's presentation earlier. So Tim Kruger is a co-founder of Carbon Gap, which is a climate not-for-profit focused on eliminating carbon dioxide and unlocking the potential of carbon removal. And he also chairs their advisory board there at Carbon Gap. He is a senior associate at Oxford Net Zero, and he previously ran the Oxford Geoengineering program at the Oxford Martin School for 12 years between 2010 and 2022. This multidisciplinary initiative assessed the technical, social, and ethical issues associated with the full range of proposed greenhouse gas removal and solar radiation management techniques. He is a co-author of the Oxford Principles, which proposed a governance framework for geoengineering research. And outside of all of this, I don't know where he finds the time, but he is involved in 2 startups. Origin, he is the founder and chief scientist there, which is developing a technology to decarbonize lime production and remove carbon dioxide from the air. And DryGrow, he's also co-founder there, which is developing technology to grow high protein crops in arid environments using a fraction of the water required by conventional agriculture. So thank you so much, Tim, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexis, and thank you for inviting me here, and welcome to everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and get this document up. So hopefully you should be able to see that now. Can you see that? Good. Yeah. So I don't need to do any more introduction. Alexis has done that, so thank you very much for that. But what I want to do is I want to tell you a story as well. And like all good stories, it starts in a traditional way. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, the climate was stable. Since the end of the last ice age, temperatures have jiggled around by about half a degree up, half a degree down. And that climate stability has allowed us to have agriculture, settled living, and civilization. But we're breaking through the bounds of that stable climate. Already temperatures have risen by over a degree centigrade, and they're going up and up. We need to think of global temperatures in the way that we think of the temperature of our body. 1 degree, you're feeling pretty unwell. 2 degrees is a raging fever, and 3 degrees, you don't live very long with that condition. And it's probably the same with our tenure on the planet. So we have the ambition of the Paris Agreement to hold temperatures below 2 degrees and have a target of 1.5. And you'll hear the slogan, keep 1.5 alive. And while it's definitely useful to have positive framing, it's also good to have realistic framing of where we are. Last year, the average temperature was just below 1.5 degrees. Now, this could be because we have what's known as an El Nino effect, which is boosting the temperature slightly, but the trend is very much upwards. And indeed, this year we can expect to exceed 1.5 degrees is most likely. And so we really haven't got much time to avoid crossing that 1.5 degree threshold. We may be able to come back from it, but we will probably cross it. There's a very good website, which is run by the Mercator Climate Change Institute, and it's called a climate clock. And what it shows is how much of the carbon budget, as John said, CO2 is cumulative. It's the total amount that we've emitted over all time that is the important thing. And we've been munching our way through the budget. We have less than 5 years at current emission rates before we will cross that 1.5 degree threshold. There's something I really like about this clock. It shows how our time is ticking down. And something I really don't like about it, and it's the level of accuracy. Because to be honest, we don't know. We might only have 2 years. We may already have passed the threshold of budget, or we may have 10 years. But the best estimates are we have about 5 years at current rates of emission. So emissions have grown steadily. It's about 42 billion tons, including per year, that we're adding to the atmosphere. And while there may be some, because there's land use change as well, this graph just shows fossil emissions, but while it may have stabilized a bit, the long-term trend has been upward. We need to stabilize it, but we need to do more than that. We need to cut emissions. We need to get to net zero. Every time this graph progresses above zero, we are increasing the pressure on climate. So we need to get it down to zero. Just stabilizing the rate of emissions is not enough. We need to get it to zero. So that's what's happened in the past. They will need to fall extremely rapidly. And you will see charts like this that show this kind of sharp elbow of reduction in emissions. This is what needs to happen, but it doesn't mean this is what will happen. We need to very, very rapidly reduce emissions. And then we also need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So even if we reduce emissions to a small fraction of what they were before, we'll still have to remove as much as we're emitting at the end of the day. We don't get to net zero without doing removals as well. So what is carbon dioxide removal? Well, there are two principles. You need to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you need to durably store it away. So if you have something like a tree growing, and then you burn that biomass and bury the CO2 somewhere permanent, that counts. But if you release the CO2 back into the atmosphere, like in the second picture there, where you have a technique that captures CO2 from the air, but then rapidly releases it back into the air, that doesn't count. That does not reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the final one, which is called carbon capture and storage, whilst useful and essential to achieve reductions in emissions, is not actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's just about preventing emissions from industry in getting into the atmosphere. So it's useful, but it's not what we need in terms of removal. There are a wide range of different techniques that can be used, and I'll go into them in a second. This is a diagram from a recent IPCC report, and it shows that there are things that happen on the land, in the sea. There are things that happen with machines. There are things that happen with plants. There are three really important criteria to consider. Firstly is durability. Will the process keep CO2 out of the atmosphere for a long time? Adding CO2 to the atmosphere essentially is a permanent injection of CO2 into the atmosphere. It will stay there for a long time. So a removal also needs to remove CO2 from the atmosphere for a very long time. We're talking hundreds, if not thousands of years. You can do things which only remove CO2 from the atmosphere for 10 years, but in the overall scheme of things, they're not effective. We need things that are not in essentially permanent, but very, very durable. Scalability. Can it scale to a climatically material level? We need to have techniques that remove hundreds of millions, billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, certainly together. And we need to make sure that we don't put too much of our effort on things that really cannot scale to the extent required. And finally, acceptability. Is what a technique is looking to do socially acceptable? So it's absolutely essential to look not just at the engineering, the technology, to understand, can it remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but can it do it in a way that is acceptable, that is environmentally beneficial, or at least not harmful, and that is politically possible? So a number of techniques. Everyone's favorite, planting trees. Yes, trees, when they grow, take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in their biomass. But when they die, that CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. So it's not durable. And with climate change, we're going to see an increase in the number of wildfires. So there's a danger that we store CO2 in trees, and then when they burn, that CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. It's essentially piling up a pile of kindling, which, when it burns, goes up in smoke and the CO2 is released back. The other big problem is scalability. There simply isn't enough land that we're not already utilizing for other things like crop production that we could use to take a material quantity of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Maybe we could do 2, 3, 4 billion tons, but to be honest, we need a lot more than that. And so we need to look at answers beyond just trees. Biochar is a route where you take biomass and you heat it in a way that turns it into a material that won't return CO2 back into the atmosphere. But again, we're limited by the amount of land that we have. And another one is called biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. The idea here is to grow biomass, burn it in a power plant, capture the CO2 and bury it. And you can see by the arrows that the CO2 starts in the atmosphere and ends underground. This has got some appeal because it produces something useful like electricity, while at the same time taking CO2 out of the air. But again, we're constrained by the amount of land that we can dedicate to biomass for this purpose. So if the land is constrained, how about the oceans? So this is a picture of a big algal bloom off the coast of France. As algae bloom, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere. One idea is to put materials in the ocean that will accelerate the rate at which biomass can grow. But experiments on this have been inconclusive, and there's a lot of concern about the environmental impacts of such an activity. So if biological answers aren't, solutions aren't the answer, what about technical ones? This is an artist's impression of machines using a technique called direct air capture. They take CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it underground. As I say, an artist's impression. These haven't been developed at any kind of material scale, and the indications are that it will be very expensive and require a lot of energy. And finally, another idea is called enhanced rock weathering. Certain minerals will weather in a way that will take CO2 out of the atmosphere. If we grind up those minerals, they will remove CO2 more rapidly. But there's a real question of the scale at which this can be done and the speed at which it can take CO2 out of the air. So let's think about the scale required. In 2020, due to the disruption of the COVID pandemic, emissions globally fell by about 5.4%. Current emissions are about 42 billion tons a year. If we could achieve that same rate, 5.4% every year between now and 2050, emissions would fall to roughly 10 billion tons per year. It is highly unlikely that emissions will fall at this rate. Yes, there are projections. Yes, there are technological revolutions, but it's not just about having the technology, it's about deploying it. And 5.4% is incredibly fast. I hope we can do it. I hope I'm wrong, but I think we would be foolish to think that we can achieve it at that rate. To get to net zero, we're going to need between 10 and 20 billion tons of CO2 removed out of the atmosphere per year by 2050. What does that mean in terms of scale? 10 to 20 billion is a very big number to think about. So I want you to think of a wheat field, the biggest wheat field that you can think of. Perhaps you're thinking of some Canadian prairie and you've got wheat stretching for as far as you can see. Think of all the wheat fields in all of Canada. Adding that up together gives you about 4% of total wheat production. So if you look at the entire world, 25 times the amount of wheat that is grown in Canada, all the wheat grown in Russia and China and India and the States and Ukraine and everywhere else, that gives you an idea of the scale of effort that's required. And what I'm talking about here is the generations of learning, the decades of research, the regulations, the specialized equipment, everything to do with the process, and the millions of people working just to put bread on your table. And that number is 800 million tons a year, not 20 billion tons a year. 20 billion tons is what we need to get to by 2050. So we need to add an industry the size of global wheat production this year, next year, every year, the size of global wheat production. That will get us to about 20 billion. That's the scale of the challenge that we're looking at. So it's really important to understand the scale that we need. Yes, the prevention is better than a cure. We need to reduce emissions. And the more we reduce emissions, the less we will need these kinds of technologies. But we also need to be looking at how to develop and deploy these technologies at scale. We also need to look at taking CO2 out of the atmosphere as well, beyond just getting to net zero. We need to clean up the mess that we've made in the past. In the UK's case, we have historic emissions of some 80 billion tons of CO2. At some point, we will need to clean that up as well. The costs, some people say that costs will be far too high. I'm running out of time, so we'll skip through a few of the slides. It could be just $600 a ton is what one estimate is. I think we'll be able to get it for a lot less than that. I use a cow to explain how this can be achieved. So if I ask you how much a fillet steak costs, cow costs $2,000 to raise. It can cost 10 kilos of fillet steak per cow. The logical answer is the cost of fillet steak is $200 per kilo, but that's the wrong answer because you have other cuts of meat that you can also sell, so you can divide the costs across. And there are techniques that take CO2 out of the atmosphere that have co-benefits and will reduce emissions, reduce the cost of cutting emissions. But it's useful to think, what would be the impact of removing carbon dioxide for $100 a ton? It would create a rational, moral, and global price for carbon, and we would be able to go beyond net zero. A rational price of carbon, at the moment, those people who emit carbon dioxide are effectively getting a subsidy. They're not having to pay the full cost of the damage they're doing. What we could do is we could impose that cost to undo the harm that they're causing. There's a moral price for carbon. So there's concern called moral hazard. that if we talk about techniques to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, it will undermine the will to cut emissions. However, I would say that there's a moral obligation. If we have the means to remove CO2, it creates the obligation to do so. So actually having such technologies creates the stick with which to beat polluters. And it would create a global price for carbon, one price for the entire world. I started by talking about the period since the last ice age and the stability of the climate in that period and how we're disrupting it. We're leaving the period known as the Holocene, and we're entering the period known as the Anthropocene. That is the climate era that is characterized by human influence. We need to have a great restoration. One species of ape, our species, is leaving an indelible mark on the planet. If in 100 million years' time, a civilization as advanced as ours were to return to this planet, they would be able to see evidence of the rise of humanity etched into the rocks around us. But this display of geological graffiti is not something of which to be proud, and we need to scrub the stain of the Anthropocene. This is going to be a multi-generational challenge. We can think of it, we need to think of it as a lesson we learned in the kindergarten. If you make a mess, you need to clean it up. So can we cure climate change? It's not beyond our wit. We have the technology, we can do it. The question is it beyond our will? It's going to be a multi-generational challenge. It could be described as a cathedral project. Those people involved at the beginning may draw up the plans and dig the foundations, but they will not live to see the spires raised to their full height. But we must start in the hope that future generations will be able to finish the job. So the question is not so much can we, but will we? And the answer to that will determine whether or not future generations live happily ever after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that really measured analysis of carbon removal. I think it's, as others have spoken about in the chat, it can be quite a contentious and controversial area to discuss, and you did it really, really well. So thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for all the work that you've been doing. Really appreciate it, and thank you for your time. So now we have a bit of time for Q&A, and just while I'm with you all, just wanted to remind you as you go through the program, we'd love to hear your reflections and thoughts. You can take a screenshot of the screen that I'm sharing now with our Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn handles. We've just had a LinkedIn group made by Bruno, so thank you so much for that. And I'll be sending a link to that in our reminder, kind of follow-up email afterwards. So just a reminder on that. And then just while I have the floor, just because I've seen a lot in the chat, just making this very quickly to say, recordings are always sent out a maximum one day after, but they are also always held on the Smith School YouTube channel. The different languages take a little bit more time, so they'll be out within 2 days. And the slides are all held on the 4 participants Google Drive folder, which you've been emailed, and I've also put in the chat and in the Slack. So if you have any problems accessing that, do let us know. And then on the COP bursary, we have funding available to cover COP fee funding needs, but that will be an application form just for this cohort that will open in a few weeks, but we've gotten a lot of emails about it. So just as a reminder, that will be coming in a few weeks. So, and this is where you can find all of that stuff. So Q&A. Oh, sorry, no, just gonna stop sharing my screen. So I have a question for John first. So this is a bit of a general question just about climate science more broadly, but it was about the how carbon emissions from armed conflicts have contributed to the acceleration of global warming. So if you could answer that.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, well, actually, I just did some digging because I did see that come through. And The Guardian very helpfully did a study on this recently. I think that the war in Ukraine, or I should say the Russian invasion, is actually the very first attempt by researchers to try and gauge how many emissions are coming out of that, not just obviously on the ground, but also in terms of production. But the Guardian study estimated that about 5% of global emissions can be related back to military activity, which is a pretty massive percentage. That percentage, just to bring some context to that, is bigger than both aviation and shipping combined. So it's pretty chunky. Another way to think about it is the finance dimension around militaries. And I know that defense spending is, I think, about $2.8 trillion a year. And that is exactly the amount of money that we need to be investing in clean energy technology to decarbonize at the pace we need to do to get to the pace we need to do by 2050. So that just brings it to light. I'm not saying that's going to go away overnight. Of course, it's not. We're always going to have conflict, unfortunately. But yeah, I think gauging those emissions, those kind of lost emissions from defense budgets in the military, is a really important thing to bring to light. I mean, actually something that the Net Zero Tracker that we don't currently track, but something we'd love to do one day. We don't track military, and we don't track public organisations. But yeah, so that's my long-winded answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a really good answer around a very complex question. So I've got a question for Joy, and this is very relevant given the purpose of this training. But the question is, to what extent does the absence of climate-specialized education in schools contribute to the dearth of effective storytelling and narrative engagement in the domain of climate change communication? So I don't know if Joy's still around. Otherwise, we can skip to Tim's questions. So I'll give it a sec. Okay, I think I might switch to Tim's question. So Tim, there's a question. Would love to hear more about Tim's opinions on the role of startups in pushing climate ambition. Are there certain regions that are leading in climate tech startups? Are there certain industries or regions of the world that have untapped climate tech startup potential?
Thanks very much for whoever asked that question. So I think at the moment, a lot of the work on the high-tech side is certainly being done in the global north, in Europe and North America, but that's not to say that there aren't many solutions that could come from other parts of the world. I think funding for startups is easier in those regions, and we need to do more work in getting ideas funded around the world. And there's work to be done on that from institutions like the World Bank and the IFC as well. In terms of untapped potential, I think in the area that I work in, carbon dioxide removal, I think there's a lot of potential in developing economies. And the reason I say that is because when it comes to removing CO2 from the air, it doesn't matter where in the world you're located. So if you remove CO2 from the middle of a desert, it's just as effective as removing it from an industrial area in a developed economy. So there is potential to locate technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere in places that are not traditional industrial places. And indeed, it may be cheaper because there may be resources needed for removal, which are actually cheaper in those places to do so. So I think there's huge potential to actually work on both removing CO2 from the atmosphere and applying it in a way that has development opportunities as well. So we could locate many of these deployments of this new industry that needs to develop in places where development needs are greatest.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. I don't know if Joy is back. Otherwise, I will go to another question for you, Tim, which is, you mentioned that a lot of methods don't meet durability, scalability, or acceptability standards, but are there existing methods that are successful right now, or is the best option to focus on innovation and finding more successful long-term mechanisms?
I think that I have a company in this space, so I have, as they say, a dog in this race, and so I've got to be a bit careful what I say and not being too biased. But I think that the real issue is actually about defining what success looks like. So there is a need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but the rules of what needs to be delivered in terms of how durable removals need to be and what the social constraints, so that the sourcing of biomass, if you're using biomass, those rules haven't been written. And the rules as to how techniques that remove CO2 from the atmosphere are going to be rewarded have also not been written. What we need to do is, yes, develop new technologies, but actually the role that policymakers need to focus on most is working out what success looks like. Once they've defined that, then the technologies will follow. The problem at the moment is that any governments that are working in this space are trying to pick winners, and they're never very good at that. What they need to do instead is define what success is, and that will create an environment from which winners can emerge.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tim. Appreciate it. Sorry. John, I was wondering if you could walk us through your process actually of taking and consolidating all of this information and how you select key messages when it comes to your infographics, because you have several of them on the ECIU website.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like there's a good quote actually that I'm not going to be able to recall, but you need to start walking before you can find the path. So I actually just dump anything. I try and locate the key messages across a certain report, and then I usually dump them into a program called Illustrator. And then I just start thinking of what metaphor could apply to each key message. And then I'll locate the most obvious metaphor, and then I'll start creating a visual around that. And that's what I tend to do. And then I do that for each key message, and then I try to stitch them all together. So it's quite a long process. I have been getting quicker nowadays, but it's still a really long process. So the one I took you all through before took me about 14 days. Luckily, I was actually in New Zealand over that period of time, and I could really focus in on doing that, and I managed to do it over about 3 weeks. But these things do take a long time. I think Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And so for me, it's actually a huge privilege to be able to try and condense and distill information, because it means that I really, really get beneath the surface and understand it. And of course, if you're explaining stuff visually, if you're explaining to a big audience, you've got a big responsibility on your shoulders to actually be accurate. And I've also got the benefit of the likes of Alexis and some of Tim's colleagues to actually validate some of the stuff that I'm putting out there. So it is a tribal effort to communicate these things, obviously starting with the scientists and ending with communicators.
Amazing. Thanks so much, John, for explaining that. Joy is back, so I'll just ask her the question, which was, to what extent does the absence of climate-specialized education in schools contribute to the dearth of effective storytelling and narrative engagement in the domain of climate change communication? So over to you, Joy.
Sorry for not being here, guys. I had a delivery show up, so I popped outside. But I mean, of course, there is a massive problem with the lack of climate change education across the board. I wish I would have more statistics to be able to show and share with you guys, but I don't currently have that on hand. But we do know that that is a problem. Of course, with education, people are better equipped to deal and understand with the challenges that they face, and also to just understand all the complexities of it so that they don't have to feel so overwhelmed by something that feels so complex and big and scientific. I think education will also go a really long way in helping understand the different ways that people can do their own parts or participate or be engaged with climate, whether that's even just being better informed for political civil action and knowing how to vote, for understanding the different pathways that they might want to pursue their careers if they want to be engaged with this. And of course, this is why the media, not just journalism, but media across the board, especially because this is how the younger generation are in a way supplementing their education of the world. It's why it's so important for the media to step up and be responsible in the way that they share their stories. And I think part of that is also, to be honest, not being so explicit about climate change all the time. We talk a lot about Trojan horsing, which is how do you bring climate and environmental themes into topics of discussion that people will be having on a day-to-day, and might not necessarily even realize that it's about climate change. Because also, as we know, I mean, in the education system, people might not be able to opt out of topics, but in the media landscape, people opt out of topics all the time. So how do we reach those people who are not necessarily inclined to watch, a documentary about climate change, but might be interested in, for example, the example I gave in my presentation, which is how entertainment or music, how are musicians and the music industry implicated within the environmental and climate space. So I think it's about being very responsible and also clever within the media space to fill the gaps that we're currently seeing within the education space. But definitely, yes, we need more education.
Thank you so much. Such a brilliant answer. So thank you so much to all of our speakers today. It's been such a pleasure to have you. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining. I'm conscious that we're running slightly over. So I'll just say our next session is on Tuesday, the 10th of September. It's called Net Zero or Not Zero, and it's about the net zero governance landscape. And we have a fabulous youth speaker, Vikrant, and then myself and my colleague Camilla, who also works closely with John Lang at the Net Zero Tracker, will be lecturing about the Net Zero Tracker and about the net zero governance landscape. So really looking forward to seeing you all on Tuesday. And in the meantime, have a lovely weekend. And thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.